Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started with this seminar today. The topic is, here, let me pull up that slide here. Well, the topic is food loss and waste and nutrition within a general equilibrium framework. We'll have three speakers, Maxime Chapeliev, Alessandra Gatto, and Marika Kuiper. And we'll take them, in each case, they'll have 10 minutes to present and 10 minutes for discussion. So we'll need to stick to that timetable pretty clearly. And I just wanted to make a few remarks leading into this. First of all, food and nutrition remain, perhaps disturbingly so, such key topics in the global policy agenda. So after decades of decline over the last 5-6 years, undernourishment globally has been rising. And that was even before COVID and even before the recent conflict in Ukraine. At the same time, there's been an explosion in obesity around the world with attendant serious health issues. And often these phenomena exist within the same country, within the same region, even within the same household. So the nutrition is obviously a key issue. It also, food and nutrition lie at the heart of the planetary boundary challenge that we face. Many of the planetary boundaries that we're now threatening to exceed, whether it's biodiversity, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, greenhouse gas emissions, these are closely tied to agriculture and food production. So any attempt to curtail to meet those planetary boundaries will have implications also for food prices, nutrition, and one of the levers often discussed is food waste. So we need to get a handle on what food waste is, where does it come from, and potentially changing diets. So this is all really important stuff to be considering in an economy-wide context. So we're really lucky to have three speakers who've been wrestling with this issue, wrestling with how to get these features into a GTAP database, a GTAP type model. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and start. And our first speaker is Maxime Chapeliev, who's going to talk about introducing nutritional accounts into GTAP. Maxime is with the Center for Global Trade Analysis at Purdue. So over to you, Maxime.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm glad to see some familiar faces and some new faces here, at least names, yeah. And hope you can see my screen and hear me. Okay, great, yeah. So I'll start this seminar by discussing some of the recent work on incorporating nutritional accounts to the GTAP database. So I'll start with motivation, why it is important. So Tom has already nicely discussed the potential impact of this work, but I'll focus particularly on this development in the GTAP context. Then I'll discuss an overall approach of how we tackle this issue. Then we'll provide a brief overview of the database that we have constructed. And then we'll provide an illustrative application and close with some discussion in terms of limitations and steps moving forward. Just to note, this is based on the recent paper in the Journal for Global Economic Analysis. And on the next slide, I'll provide a link to that paper. It's freely available. Anyone can download it. There is also a policy application that accompanies this paper in Prime GTAP. So, and the size of the application allows to run it without JMPEG license. So anyone can test and replicate the results. So in terms of motivation, why it is important to represent nutritional accounts, not in general in modeling framework, but in particular in the computable general equilibrium or integrated assessment modeling framework, and that's because the post-farm gate value chains make up most of the food expenditures. So it's really important to trace what is happening to food after it leaves the farm. Yeah, so in many countries, over 80% of all expenditures actually happening outside of direct consumption from farm, And as we'll see later in this presentation, in many cases, it's even consumption in service sectors. Yeah, so out of home food consumption, in restaurants, schools, and so on. Another layer is that, of course, we have a variety of policy applications we can be talking about here. Yeah, so Tom mentioned hunger, obesity, food availability. We can be also talking about nutritional composition of food, which I'll also showcase here later today. Dietary shifts, shift from, for instance, to vegetarian diets or eat Lancet diets. And also, indirectly, what are the nutritional implications of other policies, so like trade policies or climate policies or any other policies that might not directly target their nutritional component, that aspect, but would have implications for nutrition. Yeah. So with this in mind, we first, of course, looked into what has been developed so far and trying to understand, the potential contribution of this work. And there are some limitations in the earlier studies that we try to address here. Of course, it's worth mentioning that it's not a new area, so a lot has been done here, and paper provides a detailed overview of recent advancements, and many teams have worked in this area, including Magnet team and AIM team. ERS team and many others, IFPRI. So we are building on quite a lot of early advancements in this area, but still some limitations exist. So first, studies not always trace out of home food consumption. Explicit tracking of transformation from primary to processed commodities is often missing, and then representation of non-food categories, feed, seed, losses, other uses is sometimes lacking. And then finally, one of the key issues is that most of the earlier databases have not been publicly available. So in this regard, we also try to address this. And on the bottom, you can see the link to their paper in the Journal for Global Economic Analysis, which you can download. So what we do in this effort, and I'll just briefly walk through the steps, that we construct the database, which is largely based on FAO's food balance sheets. So we calibrate our data to FAO. We also combine a number of other estimates, including fish supply from Fish.J. We complement it with bilateral trade flows, and then we trace their food consumption, supply and consumption along the value chains, transforming from primary to secondary equivalents using Leontief inverses, and also trace their food embodied into the bilateral trade, taking and again largely calibrating to FAO food balance sheets supply. So essentially, we replicate FAO food balance sheets in the GTAP consistent framework for all 200 plus primary commodities from FAO production data, and then we aggregate and map it to the GTAP database, along the way reconciling GTAP and FAO data. So this is in a very short explanation what we are doing here. So on this slide, you can see an example of a conceptual framework and how we are transforming primary supply and tracing it along the value chains. Yeah, so we start from domestic supply of primary commodities, and we distinguish various categories, non-food categories, which we map to various GTAP drivers. So we have feed, seed, losses, other uses. And then we distinguish between direct consumption of primary commodities. So this would be in the final consumption category. And then we do the processing part of the commodities. So we trace it either through domestic value chains or through bilateral trade flows through exports, and then tracing it finally to their final country of commodities consumption. Okay, so what now we're moving to the part with a overview of the constructed database. So what we are observing with these data flows incorporated to the GTAP. So first, we on this slide you can see a composition of food supply, and of course it's largely varies across countries. So for instance, we can see that in the case of India, not surprisingly, the share of calories that are supplied by rice is 26%, while, for instance, in the US, the share is much lower and more, is supplied by other grains, including wheat, other grain crops, and so on. So one other important aspect of the database that we try to kind of incorporate is the implementation of the food supplied out of home or food supplied from services. So it is a well-documented fact that in high-income countries, largest share of food is being supplied by service sectors or consumed out of home. So we see here that based on this GTAP estimates, global average is 12% is consumed out of home, while in India it's around 6% and US is over 27%. So we can then also trace how this food consumed out of home can be compared to survey data in selected countries. So the survey data shares are indicated here by red triangulars. So we see that in general, our patterns roughly match what is being implied by surveys. And of course, the composition of foods consumed out of home differs by country. So across sectors, in some cases, more could be, but of course, most is coming from restaurants, yeah. So which in the case of GTAP is hotels and restaurant sector. Finally, we also observe a relatively high regional variation in the composition of crops, composition of different foods, yeah, in terms of calories per $1. And that's one point that Marika would discuss in her presentation, which might imply some modeling complications. So when you have a switching of imports across different sources, we might end up with very high variations in calories, changes in calories embodied into imports from different sources. So finally, last couple of slides with showcasing an application of this database, and this is based on the Run GTAP archive that is available, based on the link that I have shown on second slide. So what we are looking here is the impact of eliminating import tariffs, bilateral import tariffs across regions. So we have grouped GTAP regions into three kind of stylized categories. So high with calorie consumption above 3,000 kilocalories per capita per day, medium between 2,500 and 3,000, and low below 2,500. And we are eliminating import tariffs on bilateral trade flows across these countries. So what we see is that, of course, food supply increases following this policy experiment. So we have a reduction from domestic food supply because it's becoming, because imported food is becoming relatively cheaper compared to domestic food production. And so we see an increase of food imports from different destinations, and we can also trace in this database changes in proteins, fats, carb supply, and changes are in the range of up to 4% in case of fats in the low income countries, and between 1 and 2% for kilocalories. We can also look into the supply of food changes across different commodities and destinations here, and this can be linked to their level of import tariffs. So, for instance, in the case of processed rice in the medium region, we have been observing an import tariff above 20 or 30%. So its elimination leads to a pretty substantial increase in imports of food from other destinations by the medium region. So processed food is also impacted substantially, yeah, because it has been regionally protected. So to conclude and pave some limitations and way forward in terms of this research agenda. So what we try to do in this effort is to incorporate nutritional accounts to the GTAP database, making the database publicly available to GTAP users. The database can be readily linked to the static GTAP model simulations in relatively simple manner, as showcased in these applications and in the journal. Of course, there are quite a few limitations, and some of them are discussed by other speakers in the seminar. So, of course, as always, there could be some data improvements implemented in terms of better representation of fish trade. We also made some simplifying assumptions on how to represent small countries, which are not available in FAO's food balance sheets. So those can be improved based on country-specific data. We can also add representation of macronutrients in the database, which is an important point when tracing nutritional implications of various policies. Selected accounts can be further detailed, and Alessandro will discuss the case of food loss and waste, how it can be enriched in the framework. We can also think about incorporating additional flows of biomass and other environmental extensions such as land, water, which is linked to nutritional accounts. And finally, applications in the dynamic modeling framework, which is also a very important point, would can lead to some complications, and that's what Marika would discuss in her presentation. So I will stop here. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Maxime. Yeah, I think we'll take questions on this presentation now. I did see one in the chat already from Shen. What about stocks, changes in stocks, Maxime?
Yeah, so in terms of stocks, we distribute them across categories in this approach, because we do not kind of represent them explicitly. So we also, I should also mention, when we implement the GTAP FAO's food balance sheets, we take a 3-year average. So that's also largely kind of averages out stocks, stock changes in stocks, but whatever remains, we distribute them across other categories, to essentially eliminate this.
Mary Burfisher has a question. Ginger, should I read these out rather than having people come on?
It doesn't matter. Either people can post them in there, or you guys can raise your virtual hand for Tom to call on. Okay.
Mary Burfisher talks about the other food sector, large and heterogeneous. I think Marika will be talking about this a little. Do you want to comment as well, Maxim?
Let me see the comment.
Just talking about the huge other food sector that's got so much in it.
So in terms of other food sector, indeed, it's a very heterogeneous. So what we're observing is a large variation in terms of kind of calories per US dollar in this sector. So for instance, on this chart, so we see this food products. So this is their combination of many processed food commodities. Now in the constructed database, we can trace the composition of the food process sector. So at least in their reference year representation, we can we can trace what are the primary commodities that are coming into this food process sector, and in this way, at least to some extent, disentangle them. But yeah, otherwise, in the modeling applications, that could bring us issues because of very high heterogeneity in the composition of this sector. So in terms of changing, sources of imports of these commodities and other, related dimensions. Of course, we try to because we first construct the food balance sheets at a very disaggregated commodity level, so even more disaggregated than 98 categories in FAO, we try to calibrate in the reference years the caloric and nutritional content to FAO. So in that regard, we are reflecting country-specific composition of this sector.
Okay, other comments or questions? Shen, you've got another question, please.
Thanks, Maxim. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I had issues with my camera, sorry. Quick, thanks for the explanation on the storage part. And also a related question on the FAO database. I noticed that there is both food balance sheet and also supply utilization accounting. It seems like in the most recent data, they were trying to separate the two. And with SUA, supply utilization accounting, they were trying to include more detailed categories of the balance data along with calorie conversion units. And also, for example, as you just mentioned, you have like around 100 food balance sheet items, but I think for the other data set, they had like around 400 or more items there, which could be of use here, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Indeed, so actually what we do here, we rely on, so we first construct the we replicate the food balance sheets with 200 plus commodities, assuming, making some assumptions regarding commodities within food balance sheets categories, yeah? So to some extent, we utilize the supply utilization accounts. But then we aggregate them essentially to GTAP sectors. Yes, so this helps to capture the heterogeneity, but still in GTAP database we end up with a relatively aggregate categories. Yes, so it's all kind of implicitly embodied there. Yeah.
Let me make a note for the other speakers. As you see things come up in the chat you want to respond to, just make a placeholder there and you can respond. For example, Alessandro Marica, when it comes to your discussion. Maxime, we got a couple minutes. There are two more questions. Maybe you could handle them both in the chat. One from Angelo about preferences, utility function, nesting. You haven't talked about consumption behavior. Do you have thoughts on that? And then the other one from Vishnu on embodied nutrient content for processed food trade. So virtual trade and nutrients.
Yeah. Both good questions. So to Angelo, we just tested this database in the static implementation. So the long-term dynamic features were not so much of an issue here, and that's largely what Marica would actually discuss in her presentation. So we're using on the consumption side here a standard GTAP CDE function. Yeah, so that's. But of course, potentially, there is also a paper, earlier paper in the Journal for Global Economic Analysis by, I think, Wolfgang and Breitz and Roberto Rosso that discusses some long-term dynamic properties of consumption functions and how those can be reconciled. So that may be one place to look closely into this issue. In terms of possibility of estimating the embodied nutrient content, yes, that's possible, and we actually, these estimates are readily available from the database. It's so far it's for nutrients, so fats, carbs, not for micronutrients. So for micronutrients, that's something we can think about in the future.
Excellent. Thanks, Maxime. Thanks for crisp presentation, staying on time. A virtual hand of applause for Maxime. And we'll next turn to Alessandro Gatto from Wageningen Economic Research, where he's an economist and a PhD student, I think. At least that's what I saw online. Alessandro, over to you. Do you want to take control?
Thank you very much. So first, I would like to thank you both, Tom and Maxime, for having me here. Great opportunity to present my work. I hope you see my screen and you can hear me well.
Yep, it's looking good. Go to slideshow mode. Actually,
no,
you need to switch. We're seeing your presentation mode.
Okay, so there you go. Better now?
Yes, you got it.
Thank you very much.
Off to the races, Alessandro. Go ahead.
Thank you. Tom, you greatly introduced already why this topic is important, so I wouldn't spend much time on it. What I want to present today is basically a framework, like I'd say a pan-heuristic framework to embed the tracing of food loss and waste along global food supply chains. And what I want to discuss here or present here, it's our approach and basically the challenges we faced and we are actually the limitations of this work and the future research, emphasizing actually that there is still a lot to do and the topic requires a lot of focus. So just to give you a context on the main challenges that we see in tracing food loss and waste is that a prerequisite for tracing food loss and waste in a general equilibrium framework is that today's data on food loss and waste is mainly available on physical quantities. So to capture such flows of lost or discarded food over global supply chains is necessary to capture physical biomass flows in an economic framework. And as we know, our general equilibrium frameworks often misrepresent these biophysical balances, the physical biomass flows across economic simulations. And so what we put focus on is actually embedding the information from technical studies into a general equilibrium framework. But at the same time, there is a problem in the quality of data around food loss and waste. So there is still a highly debated definition around food loss and waste, and there is no commonly adopted global measurement. There is contrasting studies adopting different methodological approaches, different specifications of supply chains, or actually a definition and computations of food loss and waste itself. And this is demonstrated by the fact that most relevant studies today still adopt estimates from FAO, from Gustafsson, which the FAO itself claimed to be highly inconsistent due to, let's say, old methodology that was then revised and found to be inconsistent. So what we focus on here is trying to tackle these challenges on the physical side. So we basically developed a method together with Mareke, which is actually my supervisor on this, working in embedding the tracing of physical biomass flows in general equilibrium frameworks to first assess actual biomass competition, so between the different biomass types, and then obtain actually an overview of food flows from farm to fork across global supply chains, to basically have a ground to which we can integrate our food loss and waste data. And on that side, what we do is try to enhance the availability of estimates under a consistent, unique methodology. So we come up, try to compile a new global database through a literature review, basically identifying physical magnitude, the composition of food loss and waste across the stages of global supply chains and defining it's a spatial scope. So on the database side, what we do is that we start from the FAO food loss and waste database, focusing on estimates of percentages of lost and waste of total food weight across the different stages of the supply chain. We start with the FAO database and adopting a definition that now the United Nations has seemed to come up together with the FAO, adopting a consistent definition of food loss and waste. We basically perform a literature review over the data gaps of the FAO database, expanding, as you see in the figure, overall commodity, regional, and supply chain coverage, focusing mainly on data on primary food commodities. So what we do is basically expand previous, merge different literature reviews previously available. But at the same time, as you see here, there is still some data gaps. So in order to finalize our database, we adopt a gap filling procedure for data, especially the latest stages of the supply chain, such as household level for low-income regions. So with this data, then we focus on the physical tracing in a general equilibrium framework. So I build on a work from Mareike Kuiper, where she basically subtracts the monetary components out of the value-based flows of the GTAP database. And through this, we obtain, let's say, a proxy for physical quantities defined as dollar-based quantity. And in this, we define basically a balancing equation that we keep as a benchmark to test if after our simulations, the model basically consistently hold these balances, the material balances in both monetary and physical units. And this balancing equation is quite straightforward. It's basically equaling total production to intermediate demand, both imported and domestic, and final demand, both imported and domestic. So through this, through this equation, so what we do is we apply the Leontief inverse matrix. We derive it from this equation. And basically, we obtain a coefficient that allows us to have a tracing from a consumer perspective, a tracing of food that has 3 regional dimensions. So that is produced in one region, processed or crosses a second region, and finally consumed in the third region. And we do this by focusing on a commodity that is consumed either primary processed or through food services in the last region, defined also in primary equivalents. So basically here in the equation 1, you see that there is this coefficient. And basically what we do is we divide this coefficient by total production and obtain shares specifying how a single unit of output flows through the global economy. So this allows us to have a matrix in which we integrate the physical biomass data, which we derive from FAO, and basically physical production data. And through these shares that we obtain from the Leontief inverse, we decompose the primary production data through the supply chain, basically tracing food from farm to fork across the global economy, always keeping in mind our balancing equation that you see there, point 1. Then comes the part where we actually merge to the tracing of food loss, to the tracing of physical quantities, our food loss and waste framework. So here on the left, you see the modeling framework with the 3 stages, as I showed you before. So the primary production, the intermediate production, intermediate consumption, and the final consumption from physical in physical units. And at the same time, we do basically a merging of our food loss and waste database, which reports the shares of lost or discarded food across the different stages of the supply chain. And we basically associate these stages reported in the food loss and waste database to this 3-step tracing we do in the modeling part. So the agricultural losses and post-harvest losses are associated to primary production. Manufacturing and distribution and retail is associated to intermediate production, while consumption is associated, so consumption waste is associated to final consumption. Basically, the way we do this is the following. So we first start with defining from our database a coefficient that reports these shares of food loss and waste by region, commodity, and supply chain stage. And in this coefficient, you see here, basically, we define the region where the loss is occurring, the stage of the supply chain, the primary commodity that is generating the loss or the waste, and a variable. We introduce a dummy variable that has value 0 when a specific commodity goes through manufacturing, so enters the manufacturing stage and generates losses there. or value 1, so value 1 when it goes to manufacturing, value 0 when it does not go to manufacturing, so doesn't generate losses there and it's directly consumed as fresh. So this coefficient is basically multiplied to our previous tracing of food from farm to fork, and what we obtain is basically a coefficient that has the 6 dimensions, defining how actually a consumption of a specific commodity in a region generates losses from production, from the primary production to intermediate production in different regions. And so what we do, the way we do this is merging the two coefficients, assuming that basically the physical supply of food loses, so decreases after each supply chain stage, so basically enters the next supply chain stage net of the losses occurred in the previous stage. So to give you just an overview of some results that we have, here you see an image that illustrates the global losses generated by the consumption of processed vegetables in Europe. And here consumption waste is excluded because consumption waste, we assume that can only occur locally. So here you only see the losses that are generated across from agricultural production down to distribution and retail, and you see that a lot of losses occur in Europe itself, but also in other regions such as in the rest of Europe, in Central Asia, or in Latin America and Caribbean. So basically, this framework allows us to understand how our consumptions then affects the generation of losses and the quality of the losses generated across global regions. I wanted just to give you
Alessandro, couple of minutes. You're a little over already, so just a couple of minutes to wrap up.
Yeah,
please.
I just wanted to give you a brief overview of some projections we had. So for some global hotspots of food waste and food losses in 2030. So here we focus on magnitudes, and we see agricultural production and consumptions are higher spots, as well as different types of losses and magnitudes across income regions. Then also we focus on composition, so to understand the quality of these losses and waste, mainly occurring for plant-based food, but also some losses related to animal source foods, and also basically the locations of this food loss and waste. So actually, if occurs domestically in regions, or if it's actually consumed domestically in one region, but then the losses occur not in the same regions where the food is consumed, but in other regions across the world. And you can see, for example, here that low-income regions have a higher share of domestic losses, also because they export food to high-income regions, while high-income regions such as Europe, there is higher shares of imported food losses, because actually food is imported but then consumed domestically. So the losses are not generated in Europe itself. So aligning with some limitations from Maxime, we basically are finding out that there is issues with data that on food loss and waste is still largely unavailable. There is issues with trade-related data. So now this approach doesn't account the spatial factor related to trade. We see that available food loss and waste data is highly inconsistent with per capita gross food supply, such if that we merge the two, there would be no problems like obesity or undernutrition. And there is also a need for basically implementing this approach in a dynamic modeling framework, because currently it's done only ex post, so we can allow more realistic policy scenarios. And the future research, probably with Maxime, we're working on this, so we'll focus on development of food loss and waste abatement cost curves in a specific integration of this tracing in a GTAP 11 database, and also for providing a common ground for new studies for the circular economy. So for actually reintroducing this lost and discarded food as a production input, but at the same time expanding also this kind of tracing, of physical tracing, to other materials and not necessarily to food loss and waste, which is quite key for a circular economy. And with this, I conclude. Sorry for the small delay.
Thank you, Alessandro. Very nice presentation. So yes, let's open it for questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet, but please chime in. Meanwhile, I'll ask a question, Alessandro. We have a colleague in our department, Jake Rickard-Gilbert, who works a lot on post-harvest losses in sub-Saharan Africa. And he often makes the point that these producers are very aware of the losses that they're experiencing, and they're making these kind of economic decisions whether to invest in further loss or not. It also depends on whether they're going to be eating the food or someone else is going to be eating it. If they're going to be eating it, they don't put this insecticide in, but if they're selling it, they might. And in general, he finds in his surveys that the estimates of post-harvest losses are much smaller. You know, this micro survey, farm level, smaller estimates than, say, some of the FAO estimates that have been published in the past. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yes, so for sure there is we see that the low-income regions have the majority of losses occurring in the field. So it's for sure related to technology, especially conservation technology. So the problem is storing food without cooling facilities and so on. So that's probably the main causes of why we find that there's such a high estimates in low-income regions for this. The problem also for necessarily for farmers to reduce these losses, it's always a matter of convenience. So is it cost effective to actually go in the field and start collecting such residues in the case of agricultural production or post-harvest, and do something? Because at the end, circular practices in agriculture are millennial. So like farmers would feed their animals the leftovers for their crops productions, and it's a common practice. The problem is the scale nowadays that basically impedes in such practices. So somehow there has to be also an incentive for farmers to just go in the field and collect such materials and reintroduce them in the field. And we do not see them nowadays, exactly because the market does not have interest in this yet. But probably with the right interventions, there can be some assistance in making this more profitable. So in making it more applicable, let's say, to invest also in the collecting of this waste. And yeah, in terms of reduction itself, it's always a matter of technology. So you can reduce food loss and waste, reducing food supply, but that doesn't tell you nothing about the shares you reduce, only with again with some technological improvements, I think.
Thanks, Alessandro. Florian Freund has his hand up. Florian.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, for this very interesting work. I have a question because, for example, for fruit and vegetables, you can either buy them directly, so unprocessed, or you can buy them in process. So you can buy tomato directly or as a canned tomato. What the figures you're showing, is this only the average of both, or can you distinguish between manufactured and non-manufactured food? And you were mentioning that you were not considering household waste, if I understand it right, because it's very local. So I did not really understand the last point. Maybe you can clarify that.
So basically, we do trace. So the losses are imputed to primary commodities, tracing so flowing to both food processes and food services. So if you drink at a restaurant an orange juice, or you eat at home an orange, what I will be reporting is in primary equivalence the losses that are generated from farm to fork in primary equivalence, because at the end food loss and waste data, it's mainly reporting only on primary commodities. So everything is converted back to primary equivalence. And for the second question, we do include consumption waste. It's just that the picture I showed there was to actually show the trade links. So that was excluded from there because food waste is not is only occurring domestically, and therefore so the last because it's consumed domestically. Meanwhile, losses can be consumed domestically. I mean, food can be consumed domestically, but still losses at the beginning of the supply chain can occur somewhere else. So in that figure, probably was a bit misleading. We were reporting only the losses, but in general, this framework includes the whole supply chain, so also households and consumer waste.
Alessandro, we'll take one more question here. Shen Chao again. Shen?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alexandro. Just a very quick question on the data availability. Is it already available to public now? Or, I mean, I just noticed on your slide, could be a special release with GTAP database. Is there a timeline on that?
For sure, it's bound to the GTAP database 11 itself. And hopefully, probably it's a better question for Maxime, but in the coming year, we hope so. And also, this database is now under review, so I also hope that that will be out soon.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maxime, do you want to chime in on that? Any other thoughts? And obviously, it'll be of interest to people.
Yeah, on release, so GTAP 11, once it become available, then we start incorporating nutritional account to the database, and post that we would implement the food loss and waste. So hopefully, sometime next year. That's an estimate.
Great. Thanks very much, Alessandro. It's a great topic. Good luck wrapping up the thesis and dealing with your supervisor, who's coming on next. So yeah, it's really great to have Marika Kuiper here, senior researcher at Wageningen Economic Research. She's been thinking about these issues for a very long time, and I think she's going to give us some insights into the deep problems or philosophical thoughts about this. So Marika, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure what Alessandro's hardest thing is to deal with food loss and waste or dealing with me. We'll find out in the end. Yeah, I'm not sure why I'm in the end, because I think I might be a little bit less optimistic. Let's see if I get this thing going first. Presentation mode. Is that all right?
Looking good.
Good. Okay. Yeah, so I'm at the end, and I probably have more problems for you than solutions. So I'm not sure if that's a good ending of a seminar, but yeah, I'll see what I can do. Just a little bit of background. What I'm basing most of the comments on here is not on the work by Alessandro, by Maxime, the nutrition database, but actually the work we've been doing within Magnet, our model, on tracing quantities of macronutrients, calories, fats, carbs, and proteins. It actually goes quite a while back. An EU project we did in 2012 to 2017. And we're actually using it still a lot to judge the food consumption and baseline calibrations. And mostly we focus on the calorie developments. We also use it as a basis for implementing diet shifts. If you have more interest in Magnet, on the left is a bit of the thing, of how it looks. So we have a GTAP core, and then we have all sorts of modules around it. And one of these modules is this nutrition module. Technically, it's slightly different from what Maxime presented, and it's also referred to in his background paper. It's actually iteratively computed within the model, so it's not Leontief inverse, so it's less precise on indirect use, and we initialize at private household consumption values. Also, I think the consumption, it's the values that Maxime works with as well, and there's some issues with that. So that's the background. 3 lessons that I learned that I want to share with you, and I don't have the solutions for all of them, is one of the things, and Alessandro already referred to this earlier on, is that you have to start balanced. So make sure that when you start tracing that you get as close as you can to the physical flows, and don't include other stuff in there. We also find that, and Maxime referred to this, that some products are less equal than others. So there's quite some product heterogeneity, and that can really lead to very weird changes in nutrition indicators. And we have what we commonly refer to within the Magnet team as the exploding people problem. It's that in the long run, simulations, calorie consumption can go really out of whack. And it's mostly due to lack of change in processed food. So I want to quickly go into all 3 of these. So start balance. The common approach is that, and I've basically been looking at what other people have been doing in terms of tracing flows, is that they use values in a base year as proxies for quantities. Basically saying, okay, this is the best possible value we have to approximate a quantity. But actually it doesn't use all the information that you have within the GTAP database, because from the GTAP database, you can actually deduce that there are quite some flows that are not material. They're taxes, transport margins, and this is especially the case for imports. So if it really helps your balancing if you remove these flows. So take out all the taxes, duties, subsidies, transport costs that you know are in the flows that you're interested in. And this is what Alessandro already said, that we call this dollar-based quantity. So these are basically as close as we can get to a quantity using only GTAP data. And then we check this, that actually if you do this, we actually find that the material balances actually hold in the base data. So that's, I think, a plus for the GTAP database. So it's not only consistent in value terms or dollar values, but also if you get to this quantity approach. Now, does this matter? This is just an example for processed food. There was already a question there. On processed food, this is not about the composition, but about the values. And basically what you see if you start doing is that the share of import, or basically the importance of imports becomes lower, because imports, by the time they reach the consumer, they have all sorts of other taxes and transport costs included in there. If you take these out, and also the export subsidies, you basically see that the import share is lower than it is when you use the value numbers. And it matters a bit by region, by product, and it can vary a lot, it can vary very little, depends. But overall, if you want to do material flow tracing, at least make sure that you start from a balanced starting point. So that's the first one. Then the one on heterogeneity, there's a lot of issues there. One thing is already, if you look at the, one thing is, I think something that already came up in the questions on other food. That's a bit of a mess because it uses all sorts of primary products in different quantities in different regions. So you get different calorie contents than you have for primary products. But even if you look at the primary products, they're already problematic. And this is because the FAO commodity data are much more detailed than the GTAP data. So when we aggregate them, you actually get different compositions in terms of FAO commodities. So if you look at fruit and veg, that's, I think, the easy example to imagine. If you come from a more warmer region, it could be more tropical crops, seeing pineapples that are nice and sweet. Whereas in temperate regions, they are apples and pears that are a little bit less sweet, less sugar, less calories. Basically, these are very different products. And if you then compute the nutritional content per kilogram of product or per dollar of purchase, you really see this variation by source region. This in itself, of course, only signals that the aggregates that we have in the GTAP database are not homogeneous products, but they can cause really problems in your assessments of nutrition. And especially we see this with calories, that even everything stays the same. So your total level of consumption stays the same, but you switch suppliers, you can get a huge increase in calories or a huge decrease in calories, which does not make a lot of sense when you do policy analysis. And the drawback of this is also that because this is actually linked to the switch between domestic and imported, and with the imports the switch between regions. This also affects actually the ONTIF inverse that underlies Maxime's database. So the numbers that are in the database actually should change following simulations, even if you're not doing dynamic simulations, simply because the flows between regions are changing. And to give an example, this is from the Magnet database. I looked at, this was just a model aggregation I had at hand, 8 region model aggregation, and then you basically see a lot of variation. Variation for grains, raw milk, and fish are not that large, so they're pretty homogeneous. But the other primary sectors show really large variations. Fruit and veg is actually not that bad. Oilseeds is pretty bad. Other crops is really, really varying. I think it's a very diverse sector. And cattle and the OAP, and that's basically poultry and pigs, is also different, and that's not strange because it depends also what a country focuses on, because the calorie content of, say, pork is different than the calorie content of poultry. So the composition of poultry pork within OAP will actually affect the calorie per dollar that you get. Now, this is just the primary commodities. You can imagine if you then go to the other food sector that uses different combinations of these inputs by regions, the problem gets a lot bigger. So what to do? We haven't never really fully resolved this, but just some things that you can think of. One thing is to just ignore it. And I think Wolfgang Riet actually does this. He computes the global average nutritional content per primary sector. And then you basically assume it away. The other option is to disaggregate your sectors to basically get the key heterogeneity in there. We do a lot of disaggregation within Magnet, not for this reason, but it does help in terms of the nutritional composition. The other thing, it doesn't really fix the problem with the Leontief-based nutritional data because those flows will still be different, and you really have to recompute the nutritional content actually. So actually you should do an ex post calculation because you cannot compute the Leontief inverse within a model simulation. And one option that we have played with a bit in some studies is actually to adjust the Armington elasticities. So then you don't really solve the problem, but you basically prevent the large swings between different regions, just to basically capture the heterogeneity that's within these products. But none of these are perfect solutions, so it's a bit of a struggle. Then finally, our exploding people problem. There is something called a nutrition transition. So basically, with rising incomes, people start to consume more and more of processed foods, and this actually is really picked up by the demand system. You can see it in the income elasticity. So if you then look at the economics of it, the expenditure share of processed food, that will look really good when you trace, say, the historical pattern and you project to the future. So that's all good and nice. But then when you compute the calories per capita, you actually get problems. One thing is that if you look at high income countries, they're already really at a very high level of calorie consumption, but they will still increase their calories if their income grows. It's not that massively problematic. The biggest problem actually what we call our exploding people is in low income countries, which have initially very low levels of processed foods and might experience very high levels of economic growth and start consuming a lot more processed foods. Now, where does this come from? It has to do with the calories per dollar of expenditure on processed food. And this again is from the Magna database. So if you look at the processed food in low income countries, you get a lot more calories per dollar spent on processed foods and a lot less in high income countries. The reason for this is that there's a transformation in processed food chain with the rising incomes. You get more money spent on packaging, advertising, machineries, all sorts of other things, but basically non-calorie stuff. So basically, when you spend $1 on the processed food in a high-income country, you pay more for the package, for the advertising, for everything else, and you get less calories for that $1. And actually, we don't really capture this radical change in cost structure in low-income countries. So it basically means we're overestimating the amount of calories over time flowing through processed food in low-income countries. So to recap, so start balanced. I think to really make sure that you at least know that in your base data, you already have a material balance that matches. Somehow deal with heterogeneity. I think I don't think that's a perfect solution, but at least be aware of it and make some adjustments if you see basic problems there. And then with the exploding people, I think we really have to work on the technical change in processed food. We haven't got around to doing that really well. And I think also to link back to something Tom said at the beginning on the planetary boundaries, I think it's also very relevant for that discussion because it overestimates the amount of primary products that you need for food production or food consumption. And it will thus also overestimate the environmental impacts of food consumption. So maybe the extent to which we exceed the planetary boundaries is less if we better capture this change in processed food sector. That's all from me.
Thanks, Marika. I can tell you've thought deeply about this and wrestled with it for a long time. Yeah. Willem has his hand up. Go ahead, Willem.
Yeah, hi. So I don't know if I should be the first to ask a question because I talk to Marika regularly, of course. But I had an alternative problem with the expo people, which I'm very familiar with, and I wanted to check with you. So I've experienced this, but then it was more an issue with big shifts in imports. So and it has to do with like the amount of calories per dollar, so to say, that's from a certain country, and then especially towards future when you've got big shifts in where the food is imported from, then you can get big swings also the other way. But I've often seen it in African countries that then where they import from has a much higher calorie per dollar in the base data, so to say, and then through this calculation, the whole thing explodes. I think it became a bit better with Maxime's update of the agricultural, the FEO value targeting, so to say. But do you still see this now, or do you now mainly see what you described?
But I think what you're referring to is really what I described in that you have different calories, and that problem remains. I mean, I did this calculation on the recent data that we have, so it's still there. But I haven't run any long run simulations with this on on low income countries. But I would still expect it to be there, especially on from the processed food side.
Yeah, but
All
you
right.
see this only in the processed food then. Okay. Well, perhaps I'm going to much detail.
Maybe you want to go bilateral on the specifics.
Yeah. Sure. Sorry.
Yeah. Marika, this question about the processed food sector is very interesting. There's a technical change aspect, but one thing that has been observed or empirically estimated in the US is actually a non-zero elasticity of substitution between the primary product and the intermediate inputs, which is kind of like what you're talking about. Well, we're seeing it now. I happen to be in Berlin, and the bread I was getting now has gotten smaller. So there's more packaging, less bread. So that is a phenomenon that has been empirically estimated in the past. And it would also play a role in this context to, you mentioned technical change, but there could be an endogenous component if the primary product becomes relatively more expensive as it has now, then you get more packaging or more whatever, marketing.
I think that for sure could help, but I think there really is a big transformation, especially in low-income countries. That I don't think you want to capture that with a substitution elasticity there. I would hope that would be a little bit more marginal, because I think otherwise we get problems that you don't consume any calories anymore and just only advertising. So I'm not sure if that would be good. And for that, I haven't seen any good estimates yet. Maybe that's why.
Okay. Other questions for Marika on this provocative presentation? I was wondering whether Maxime wanted to chime in at all about, optimism, pessimism, where do we come out on the spectrum? Any thoughts from your side, Maxime?
So one thought I have, and that's what Marika also mentioned, is kind of an adjustment of caloric content. So I was just wondering whether it's could be possible to try and do some historical replication to see whether there has been any, use GTAP different historical years and see whether there has been an adjustment in nutritional content. It's a composite sectoral level over time. And then essentially when we are talking about shifts in trade patterns, so what is probably happening is that a new trade patterns, they have a very different food composition. So and we need somehow kind of to guesstimate what this food composition is based on our either prior knowledge or some assumptions. So if we do that, we might avoid this kind of exploding caloric imports. But I think it's really complicated to guess what is a composition, because for that we need either some historical data and try to estimate it in some way, or so that's one thought I have, and I think that's an area that we might probably look closer into.
I think it's also important, apart from the exploding people, and that I now realize it really has implications for the planetary boundaries as well. Because if you don't take this into account, this really shift in how much actual primary food goes into processed food, you will overestimate the impact. So I think from that discussion, it's also relevant to get a better grip on this. And I've also been thinking and looking at either historical data, looking at the spread within the GTAP database, as far as we can tell. So you get a bit of benchmarking. They say, okay, given what we see there with rising income structures, this is how we expect the input composition to change. But I never got around to really dive deep into that.
But also the dimension of food loss and waste is also important. So it could be the case that food loss and waste shares, and we definitely see that they are higher in high income countries. So when income grows, the share of food loss and waste would be also increasing. So that's something that would also kind of drive down the actual net supply of calories.
Gary Professor just raised a point that was on the tip of my tongue, and that is why couldn't the caloric content of food evolve with income. Well, that's in fact what we've done in this simple model that we use for long run projections. We have something called CalCom, and that varies with income based on historical relationships. So kind of capturing the point that Marika was making, and the caloric content diminishing with increased income.
Well, you would get that. I mean, we always compute the calorie content based on the primary commodities going into processed food. So that would be the channel for me. I mean, we never estimate it on its own. I mean, if you would just take a shortcut and say, okay, we just estimate the calorie content separate from what's going in as a primary commodity, you could do that. So I would be more concerned with kind of reducing the primary content actually of processed food in the end, because those are the guys that actually are carrying the calories from the farm to the fork.
Okay. Mary, do you want to follow up on that?
No, but I do want to say that this was a fascinating presentation, and it really developed the complexities of looking at the nutritional content along the food supply chain. All three presentations were really terrific.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. I think it's been a great seminar. Thanks to Ginger for organizing it, and thanks to each of you for your presentations. I'll give you, if you want to go around the table, you could get your 60-second soundbite if you want to take one. We'll start with Maxime and then go to Alessandro and then Marika.
So first I would also like just to thank Tom and Ginger and participants for attending this seminar. So I think the area is although a lot of work has been done here, it's still evolving pretty rapidly, and we see there are a lot of challenges and issues here. And even when it's multi-layered, so we dig into food loss and waste, we see there are a lot of issues there. Yeah, we dig into a specific food loss and waste. At the processing stage, it's even more. So I think it's a very fascinating area to work in, and glad for these collaborations, and just looking forward for the future work here.
Alessandro, your words of wisdom.
Thank you. Of course, I want to thank you again for having me here. It was a great experience by debut to a GTAP seminar presentation. I'm glad there is interest in this, and we are working on different aspects of it, and in my specific focus on food loss and waste. It's basically a cross-disciplinary topic, and from the nutritional part, it's really relevant, but it's also relevant for this kind of economic transition that we want to have towards more circularity. And I'm glad that there's also the GTAP Center is investing and putting interest in the circular economy, and so I'm happy we're going towards these directions with the new work, and I'm really happy also Maxime is keen to cooperate with me and Marika to support me morally and technically in this. So,
great, Alessandro. Yeah, good luck with the thesis, and it's important stuff. So I'm really glad you're working on it. Marika, anything to wrap up?
No, it's always a bit, coming with all these problems and other solutions, but it's really a kind of worms. I mean, everything can look perfect when you look at the economics. I mean, I've run some tests where even first the expenditure shares based on historical trends in economic terms looks all pretty wonderful and glossy. And I was like, great, solved the issue. And then I looked at the calories and it's one big disaster. So yeah, it can be a bit discouraging, but I mean, it's something we have to grapple with, I think, one way or the other, if only because we want to talk to other disciplines and because these things really matter. And yeah, we have to just see how it works.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Excellent seminar. Ginger, anything else? I noticed you posted something about an upcoming seminar.
Yeah, why don't you give a plug to that? Because it's your thing.
Okay, well, there is a network of networks called GlassNet. That's my latest passion, and GTAP is one of the networks, and the other networks are from other disciplines. And we've had a series of seminars, and so there's a GlassNet early career workshop, early career researcher workshop coming up tomorrow, and 9 to 11 US Eastern, and three terrific speakers talking about how to successfully write and get grant proposals in the international realm, in the interdisciplinary realm, and in the inclusive realm. So these are three very successful people, very articulate. I think that'll be a great workshop. So the link is there. Thank you, Ginger, for the tip. And thank you all for participating. Excellent. And hand for the speakers again. Thank you.